She paid the fine with her last dollar. Megan's hand shook as she placed the crumpled bill on the counter, her breath shallow, her body hollowed by months of invisible collapse. Judge Peterson barely glanced at her face before waving her away, but hours later, when he opened a medical file and saw her photograph, his chest tightened with recognition. This broken woman before him had once held his wife's heart in her hands and brought her back from death. The realization carved a wound into his conscience he would never forget. Subscribe to witness the moment judgment transforms into unbearable truth. The fluorescent lights in the Boise courthouse hummed with a mechanical indifference that matched the cold air seeping through the cracks in the old windows. Megan stood in line, her body rigid with exhaustion, her fingers clutching a $1 bill that had been folded and unfolded so many times it felt more like fabric than paper. She could feel the eyes of others in the room, some curious, some pitying, most simply impatient. But she kept her gaze fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, counting the seconds until she could escape this place. The weight of the fine pressed against her chest like a stone, not because of the amount itself, but because of what it represented, the final proof that she had nothing left. Her daughter's face flashed in her mind, those wide brown eyes that still believed in her, and Megan felt the familiar sting of shame crawl up her throat. She swallowed it down, the way she swallowed everything else, because there was no room for weakness when survival was the only option. The line moved forward with agonizing slowness, each person ahead of her a reminder of how the system ground people down into numbers and files and forgotten stories. Megan's shoes, worn thin at the soles, made soft squeaking sounds against the floor, and she wished she could disappear into the walls, become invisible, cease to exist in this moment of profound humiliation. She thought of the surgeries she had once performed, the steady precision of her hands as they moved through tissue and blood, the lives she had pulled back from the edge of darkness with nothing but skill and determination. Those hands now trembled as they held $1, and the irony was so sharp it cut through her like a scalpel. She had spent years building a life, a career, a sense of purpose, and it had all come apart in a matter of months. Medical bills from her daughter's illness, the loss of her position after missing too many shifts, the slow descent into a poverty so complete it erased every trace of who she had been. Now she was just another face in a courtroom, another person who couldn't pay, another failure in the eyes of a world that had no memory and no mercy. When she finally reached the counter, the clerk barely looked up from her computer screen, her fingers typing with mechanical efficiency as she processed the parade of human desperation that passed before her each day. Megan placed the dollar on the counter, her voice barely above a whisper as she explained that it was all she had, that she would find a way to pay the rest, that she just needed a little more time. The clerk's expression didn't change, not unkind, but not sympathetic either, just the blank professionalism of someone who had heard every excuse, every plea, every broken promise 1,000 times before. She printed a receipt and slid it across the counter, her words clipped and efficient, explaining the consequences of non-payment, the additional fees that would accumulate, the legal actions that could follow. Megan nodded, though she barely heard the words, her mind already spinning with calculations she knew wouldn't add up, solutions that didn't exist, futures that felt more like fantasies than possibilities. She took the receipt with hands that had once held beating hearts and walked away, feeling smaller with each step. The courtroom itself was a vast, echoing space filled with wooden benches worn smooth by decades of waiting, and Megan found a seat in the back corner where the shadows were deepest. She watched as cases were called, as people stood before Judge Peterson with their heads bowed or their chins raised in defiance, as fates were decided with the tap of a gavel and the scratch of a pen. The judge was a man in his late 50s. his face lined with the kind of weariness that came from years of witnessing human frailty, his voice deep and measured as he dispensed decisions that would alter lives in ways he would never fully see. Megan studied him with a strange detachment, wondering what he saw when he looked at the people before him, whether he understood the stories hidden beneath the surface, the tragedies and struggles that had led each person to this moment. She doubted it. How could he, sitting in his elevated position, draped in the authority of his robe, possibly comprehend what it felt like to hold your last dollar and know it wasn't enough, to feel yourself disappearing inch by inch until even your own reflection became a stranger? Her name was called, and she stood on legs that felt unsteady, her body moving forward through sheer force of will rather than any real confidence. She approached the bench with her head slightly bowed, not in submission, but in the quiet defeat of someone who had fought too many battles and lost them all. Judge Peterson glanced at her file, his eyes scanning the details with practiced efficiency. A minor traffic violation, failure to pay on time, a history of missed court dates, and his expression remained neutral, neither harsh nor compassionate, just the blank slate of someone who had seen this story too many times to feel anything anymore. He asked her a few questions, his tone professional but distant, and Megan answered in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else, explaining her situation in the vague, sanitized language people use when they're too ashamed to tell the full truth. The judge listened, made a note in his file, and then dismissed her with a wave of his hand, moving on to the next case without a second glance. In that moment, Megan felt the full weight of her invisibility, the realization that she had become nothing more than a statistic, a problem to be processed and forgotten. Outside the courthouse, the cold November air hit her face like a slap, and Megan stood on the steps for a long moment, trying to gather the strength to move forward. The city of Boise stretched out before her, its streets filled with people who had places to go, lives to live, futures that extended beyond the next meal or the next bill. She watched them pass with a strange sense of disconnection, as if she were viewing the world from behind a pane of glass, separate and unreachable. The dollar she had given was gone, and with it went the last, tangible proof that she had ever been anything other than poor, anything other than struggling, anything other than lost. She thought of her daughter waiting at home, trusting that her mother would find a way, and Megan felt the familiar surge of determination that had kept her going through everything else. She would find a way, because that's what mothers did, because there was no other choice, because the alternative was unthinkable. But as she walked down the courthouse steps and into the cold afternoon, she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had finally broken, some essential piece of her spirit that had held her together through all the other losses, and she wasn't sure if she could ever put it back together again. Judge Peterson sat in his chambers long after the courtroom had emptied, the silence pressing against him like a physical weight as he reviewed the stack of files that never seemed to diminish. His desk was cluttered with the detritus of justice, legal briefs, case summaries, coffee cups stained brown from countless refills, and he moved through them with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this work for so long it had become reflex rather than thought. But today, something felt different, a vague unease that he couldn't quite name, a sense that he had missed something important in the parade of faces and stories that had passed before him. He thought back to the woman with the trembling hands, the one who had stood before him with her head bowed and her voice barely audible, and he tried to recall if there had been anything distinctive about her, anything that should have caught his attention. But the memory was already fading, blending into the hundreds of other memories of people in similar circumstances, and he pushed it aside, telling himself that he couldn't afford to dwell on every individual tragedy when there were so many more waiting to be addressed. The photograph appeared without warning, buried in a medical report attached to a case involving a malpractice lawsuit, and Peterson's hand froze as his eyes landed on the image. It was a professional headshot, the kind taken for hospital directories, showing a woman in surgical scrubs with her hair pulled back and her eyes focused with the intensity of someone who held lives in her hands. But it was the face that stopped him, the same face he had seen just hours earlier in his courtroom. Only this version was different, confident, purposeful, alive in a way that the broken woman before him had not been. He stared at the photograph for a long moment, his mind struggling to reconcile the two images, the surgeon in the picture and the trembling figure who had paid a fine with her last dollar. The name at the bottom of the report confirmed what his gut already knew. Megan Porter, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery, Boise Memorial Hospital, date of departure noted as 14 months prior. The words swam before his eyes as the full weight of recognition crashed over him like a wave. His wife's surgery had been 3 years ago, a night that still haunted his dreams with its visceral terror and desperate hope. Sarah had collapsed at home, her heart failing in a way that the doctors said was catastrophic. And Peterson had spent 6 hours in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and fear, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. The surgeon who had emerged from the operating room had been calm and professional, her scrubs stained with blood, her eyes tired but focused, as she explained what she had done to save Sarah's life. Peterson had thanked her with tears streaming down his face, had grasped her hands in gratitude, had promised himself he would never forget the woman who had given him back the person he loved most in the world. But he had forgotten. Not completely, but enough that when she stood before him in his courtroom, reduced and broken, he hadn't recognized her. The shame of that failure settled into his chest like a cold stone, heavy and immovable. He pulled out his phone and searched for her name, finding articles from medical journals, awards and recognitions, photographs from conferences where she stood among her peers with the quiet confidence of someone at the top of her field. There were interviews where she spoke about the challenges of cardiac surgery, the weight of responsibility, the moments of triumph when a heart began to beat again after being still, and then abruptly the trail went cold. No more articles, no more conference appearances, no more evidence of the brilliant surgeon who had once commanded operating rooms with absolute authority. Peterson dug deeper, finding fragments of information in local news archives, a daughter's diagnosis, medical bills that exceeded insurance coverage, a leave of absence that became permanent when the hospital couldn't hold her position any longer. The story emerged in pieces, each one more devastating than the last, painting a picture of a woman who had saved countless lives but couldn't save herself from the machinery of financial ruin. The contrast between what she had been and what she had become was so stark it felt almost obscene, and Peterson found himself gripping the edge of his desk as the full scope of his blindness became clear. He had looked at her and seen only poverty, only another person who couldn't manage their affairs, only someone to be processed and dismissed without a second thought. He hadn't seen the surgeon, the healer, the woman who had pulled his wife back from death with skill and compassion. He hadn't seen her humanity, her history, the life she had lived before circumstances stripped it all away. And the worst part was that he had been trained to look deeper, to understand context, to see beyond the surface. But he had failed, because it was easier to maintain the distance, to keep people as abstractions rather than complicated, suffering human beings with stories that might break your heart if you allowed yourself to truly see them. The file in his hands felt heavier now, weighted with implications he couldn't ignore. Megan Porter had stood in his courtroom that afternoon, invisible and insignificant, while he sat in judgment without recognizing the debt he owed her. She had saved Sarah's life, had given him 3 more years of mornings waking up next to the woman he loved, 3 more years of shared meals and quiet conversations and all the small moments that made a life worth living. And he had repaid that gift by dismissing her without a second glance, by seeing her only as a problem to be processed, rather than a person deserving of dignity and recognition. The guilt twisted in his gut like a knife, sharp and unrelenting, and he knew that no amount of rationalization could erase what he had done, or more accurately, what he had failed to do. As the afternoon light faded outside his window, Peterson sat alone in his chambers, the photograph of Dr. Megan Porter still on his desk, staring back at him with eyes that seemed to ask a question he didn't want to answer. How many others had he dismissed without seeing? How many stories had passed before him unnoticed? How many lives reduced to case numbers and legal jargon? How many people rendered invisible by the very system designed to deliver justice? The questions multiplied in his mind, each one a small indictment of the distance he had maintained, the walls he had built to protect himself from the overwhelming weight of human suffering. He thought of Megan walking out of his courtroom with her head bowed, clutching a receipt that represented the last of her resources, and he felt something crack open inside him, not dramatically, not in a way that would change everything in an instant, but slowly, like the first fracture in ice before it gives way. He picked up the phone, his hand steady despite the turmoil in his chest, and began to make calls, because doing nothing was no longer an option, and because he owed her more than he could ever repay. Megan returned to the apartment she shared with her daughter in a building that smelled of cooking oil and mildew, the kind of place where walls were thin and secrets were impossible to keep. The stairs creaked under her weight as she climbed to the 3rd floor, each step a reminder of how far she had fallen from the spacious house she once owned, the one with the backyard and the good school district, and the sense of permanence that now felt like a dream from someone else's life. She opened the door to find Lily curled on the couch, her small body wrapped in a blanket that had seen too many washes, her eyes glued to a television that played cartoons with cheerful voices that seemed to mock the gravity of their situation. The girl looked up when her mother entered, her face brightening with the kind of unconditional love that made Megan's heart ache with the weight of her inadequacy. She forced a smile, dropping her bag by the door and crossing the small living room to sit beside her daughter, pulling her close and breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. Lily asked how it went, her voice small and tentative, and Megan lied with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to shield her child from the full horror of their circumstances. She said it was fine, that everything was taken care of, that they didn't need to worry about it anymore. The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but she spoke them anyway, because what else could she do? Burden an 8-year-old with the reality that they were drowning, that each day brought new impossibilities, that her mother's inability to protect her from poverty was a failure that cut deeper than any surgical incision ever could. Lily seemed to accept the lie, snuggling closer and returning her attention to the television, and Megan sat in silence, feeling the familiar numbness settle over her like a shroud. She had once made decisions that determined whether people lived or died, had held beating hearts in her hands and felt the awesome responsibility of that power, but now she couldn't even keep the electricity on without juggling payment plans and borrowed time. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in as night fell, and Megan moved through the routine of dinner with mechanical precision. Pasta with butter because that's what they could afford, water because juice was a luxury they couldn't justify, quiet conversation that skirted around anything too real or too frightening. She watched Lily eat with the fierce hunger of childhood, and she felt grateful that at least her daughter's appetite was good, that the illness that had drained their savings had at least left her with the ability to recover, to grow, to have a chance at a future. But the medical bills remained. an endless mountain of paper and numbers that followed them everywhere. Reminders of the night when Lily had stopped breathing and Megan had driven through red lights to get her to the hospital. Screaming at God or fate or whatever cruel force had decided to test her in this way. The treatment had saved her daughter's life, but it had destroyed everything else, and Megan couldn't decide if that trade was worth it or if she was a terrible person for even asking the question. After Lily fell asleep, Megan sat alone in the dark living room, her body sinking into the worn couch cushions as exhaustion pulled at every muscle and bone. She thought about Judge Peterson, about the way he had looked through her rather than at her, about how easily people could dismiss what they didn't understand or didn't want to see. She wondered if she would have been different back when she was Dr. Porter, back when she wore expensive clothes and drove a reliable car and existed in a world where poverty was an abstraction rather than a lived reality. Would she have been more compassionate, or would she too have looked at struggling people and seen only the surface, only the failure, only the evidence of poor choices and bad luck, without understanding the complex web of circumstances that could trap anyone, regardless of how hard they worked or how much they sacrificed? The question haunted her because she didn't know the answer, because her own fall had been so swift and so complete that she barely recognized herself anymore. The memories of her former life came in fragments now, disconnected moments that felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. She remembered the satisfaction of a successful surgery, the camaraderie of her colleagues, the respect that came with being at the top of her field. She remembered conferences in distant cities, presentations where her research was met with interest and acclaim, the sense that she was contributing something meaningful to the world. But she also remembered the pressure, the endless hours, the weight of knowing that every decision could mean the difference between life and death, and she wondered if perhaps she had been running so hard toward success that she hadn't noticed how fragile the foundation beneath her really was. When Lily got sick, everything had collapsed so quickly. The missed shifts, the concerned conversations with hospital administration, the leave of absence that became permanent, the slow realization that her entire identity had been tied to a job she could no longer perform. Without the title, without the white coat and the operating room and the purpose, she had discovered that she didn't know who she was, and the person left behind felt hollow and uncertain. There had been moments in the depths of those first terrible months when Megan had considered giving up entirely, when the weight of it all had felt too heavy to carry any further. She had stood at the edge of that darkness, looking into it with a kind of terrible curiosity, wondering what it would be like to simply stop fighting, to let go of the endless struggle and surrender to whatever came next. But Lily's face had always pulled her back. That small, trusting face that believed her mother could fix anything, could make everything okay, could be the hero she had always been. So Megan had kept going, not because she was strong or brave or particularly resilient, but because she didn't have a choice. Because children needed their mothers, even when those mothers felt like frauds, even when they were barely holding themselves together with willpower and desperation. She had taken whatever work she could find, cleaning houses, stocking shelves at night, anything that didn't require references from a medical career she could no longer access, and she had swallowed her pride and her shame and her grief because survival didn't care about dignity. Now, sitting in the dark, with the sounds of the city filtering through the thin walls, Megan felt the full weight of her transformation settle over her, like a second skin. She was no longer Dr. Porter, no longer the surgeon who saved lives, no longer the woman who commanded respect and authority. She was just Megan, poor and invisible, another face in the crowd of people struggling to stay afloat in a world that had no safety net and no mercy. The recognition that Judge Peterson had failed to make wasn't his fault, not really, because she had learned that poverty had a way of erasing you, of stripping away everything that made you distinctive until you became just another statistic, another problem, another person who didn't matter. She had become the person she would have pitied from a distance in her old life, and the irony of that transformation was so complete it almost felt like punishment for some unnamed crime. But she was still here, still breathing, still fighting, and that had to count for something, even if she couldn't see what that something was yet. Sarah Peterson sat in the kitchen of her comfortable home, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked a garden. She tended with the devotion of someone who had learned not to take life for granted. Her hands moved with practiced ease as she prepared lunch, her body functioning with the reliable rhythm that had returned in the 3 years since her surgery, since the night when death had come so close she could feel its cold breath on her face. She hummed softly to herself, a habit she had developed in the aftermath of her recovery, a way of reminding herself that she was still here, still alive, still granted the gift of ordinary moments that she had once dismissed as mundane. The scar on her chest was hidden beneath her sweater, but she was always aware of it, a raised line of tissue that marked where a surgeon's hands had entered her body and coaxed her failing heart back to life. Her husband had been different since that night, more present in some ways, more attentive to the small details of their shared existence. But Sarah had also noticed a distance that hadn't been there before, a preoccupation that took him away into his thoughts even when his body sat beside her at the dinner table. She attributed it to the trauma of nearly losing her, to the weight of his judicial responsibilities, to the natural erosion that time brought to even the strongest bonds. But today, when he called her from his chambers in the middle of the afternoon, his voice tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name, she felt a flutter of concern that had nothing to do with her repaired heart. He asked her about her surgery, about the surgeon who had performed it, about whether she remembered the woman's name, and Sarah answered with the certainty of someone who would never forget the face of the person who had saved her life. Dr. Megan Porter had been more than just skilled. She had been present in a way that transcended mere medical competence. Sarah remembered lying in the pre-operative area, terrified and convinced she was about to die, and the surgeon had taken her hand with a grip that was firm and warm and somehow reassuring, despite the gravity of what was about to happen. She had looked Sarah in the eyes and spoken with a calm authority that cut through the panic, explaining what she would do, how long it would take, what Sarah could expect when she woke up. There had been no false promises, no platitudes about everything being fine, just honest competence and a presence that suggested this woman had faced death many times before and knew how to stand against it. Sarah had trusted her completely, had surrendered to the anesthesia with the faith that she was in capable hands, and when she woke up hours later with tubes in her throat and pain radiating through her chest, the first face she saw was Dr. Porter's, those same eyes now tired but satisfied, telling her that she was going to live. When her husband told her what had happened, how the surgeon who saved her life had stood in his courtroom that very day, how he had failed to recognize her, how she had paid a fine with her last dollar and walked out invisible and broken, Sarah felt something sharp and terrible pierce through her chest. The image of Dr. Porter reduced to poverty, stripped of everything that had made her exceptional, standing before her husband in need and receiving only bureaucratic dismissal, was almost too painful to bear. She thought of all the ways life could turn, how quickly circumstances could shift from stability to disaster, how the same person could be both hero and victim, depending on which side of fortune's wheel they landed. She had never imagined that the woman who saved her could be struggling, could be suffering, could be in a position where a single dollar represented the sum total of her resources. The injustice of it burned in her throat like acid. Sarah's husband explained what he had learned, the pieces of the story he had managed to uncover through phone calls and research. The daughter's illness, the crushing medical debt, the loss of career and status and stability. He spoke with a guilt that made his voice shake, and Sarah listened with growing distress, understanding that he was grappling not just with his failure to recognize someone he should have known, but with the larger implications of how easily people could become invisible when they fell from grace. She wanted to be angry at him, wanted to demand how he could have missed something so important, but she also knew that the fault wasn't entirely his. It was systemic, cultural, a collective blindness to the suffering of those who had once been successful. People who fell from the middle class into poverty were often the most invisible because their descent contradicted the narrative that hard work and talent were enough, that good people didn't end up destitute, that tragedy was always someone else's problem. The conversation that followed was long and winding, moving through guilt and responsibility, and the question of what could be done to address an injustice that had already occurred. Sarah insisted that they had to help, that owing someone your life created an obligation that couldn't be dismissed or ignored, that Dr. Porter deserved more than charity. She deserved recognition, restitution, acknowledgement of what she had sacrificed and what she had lost. Her husband agreed, but with the caution of someone who understood that pride could be as much a barrier as poverty, that some wounds couldn't be healed with money alone, that any gesture of help had to be offered with dignity and respect rather than pity. They talked about possibilities, reaching out through the hospital, finding a way to restore her medical license if that's what she wanted, creating opportunities that didn't feel like handouts but like the recognition she had earned through her years of service and skill. As darkness fell outside and the kitchen grew shadowy with the fading light, Sarah felt the weight of her own mortality press against her chest, a reminder that she was only alive because of someone else's skill and courage. Dr. Megan Porter had given her 3 more years of life, 3 years of mornings and meals and moments she would have missed, 3 years with the husband she loved and the children who visited and the garden that bloomed outside her window. That debt was unpayable in any conventional sense, but it demanded acknowledgement. It demanded action. It demanded that she and her husband do everything in their power to ensure that the woman who saved her life didn't have to spend hers struggling in the shadows, invisible and forgotten. Sarah reached across the table and took her husband's hand, squeezing it with a strength that belied her fragile heart, and together they began to plan how they would find Megan Porter and offer her not charity, but justice, not pity, but the recognition that she had saved a life, and in doing so had earned the right to have her own life saved in return.